Cocktails all round as bona fide Megacan connoisseur and journalist Nicholas Potter joins Megan and Konrad for a chat about rubbing Leipzigers up the wrong way and an update on the German judiciary's botch-up of the Halle trial. Rickles.
Good evening, everybody. This is Megan, and this is the latest episode of Megan's Megacan. I am here, as always, with Konrad Werner.
Hello.
And the reason we're sharing a microphone is very, very exciting because for the first time in a long time, thanks to the machinations of Miss Rona, we have a guest. Yay! We have Nicholas Potter, who is here today. And Nicholas, you're a journalist and editor at Beltar News. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah.
You're very welcome. I would like you to tell us a little bit about Beltar News, but first of all, I think we need alcohol. I've had a day. So, Nicholas, how familiar are you with Megacans, the genre of cocktail in a can?
I've had quite a few in my time.
This is good.
And I was sort of lured here on the pretense of free alcohol, so...
Yes, I did say, all the time whenever we're like, I'll see if I can get a guest on and stuff. Conrad said to me, I'm like, do they know there's like free Megacans? I'd do anything for a free Megacan.
How mega are these cans?
So in order to be a Megacan, the standard is it just has to be 10%.
Ah, so it's about strength and not size. I imagine, these Monster Energy cans?
Strength and not size, yes. Because they're actually quite small. They're only 330 mils. But anyway, so since we have a lovely guest, I've got some new ones for us to try that I discovered next week, but they look terrifying, so I didn't want to submit a guest to them. So I've got some of the nicer ones and you can choose. This I think probably maybe our favourites. I don't know.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so what we have is a Jim Beam Lime Splash, a Bombay Dry and Tonic, and a Johnny Walker and Ginger.
I will go for the gin tonic.
Oh, good choice.
Thank you.
Conrad?
I suppose I'll have the Johnny and Ginger, please.
That's 3 weeks of Johnny and Ginger in a row, I think. All right, and I'm having the Jim Beam Lime Splash, and I'm quite excited about it.
Something quintessentially colonial about my Bombay London Dry Gin.
Yeah, I'm afraid that is the slight downside of that. It's very colonial, I guess. Oh.
I give them another 2 years before their marketing revamp.
Yeah, I think they really need to. It would only enhance the Bombay Dry and Tonic if I didn't have to look at Queen Victoria's face.
That is immensely refreshing.
Isn't it?
Cheers.
Cheers. This is delicious.
This is no alcohol pop, just for the people listening. This has got a bit of a kick to it.
It's really nice to have an actual Megacan connoisseur on here. Like, I know that you're going to talk about like journalism and stuff and the news and really important things, but a lot of people are just like, I've never had one of these before. What is it? How does it work? And you're like, I've got this. It's not an alcohol pop. And I think people get them confused. Like that is, it's a real drink.
Is Megacan sort of an established term in the scene of people who drink strong alcoholic drinks from cans?
That's a great question. The term Megacan is widely used by people that I know here, and is kind of then, I talk about them a lot, but we can't claim responsibility. I don't think it's like official thing. It was coined by our wonderful friend Lindsay, who'd been sent out on a booze run from a party that was happening, and everyone was like, oh, what do you want? Should we get like blah, blah, blah? And he apparently was just like, why don't I just go and get loads of those mega cans? And thus...
History was made.
Do you want to talk about Beltar News and explain what that is?
Yeah, sure. Beltar News is an online journalistic website. It's a project by the Amadeu Antonio Foundation, which since the late 90s has basically been focusing on far-right extremism, racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination. And we're essentially the journalistic platform of the foundation. So the foundation does a lot of research, a lot of... outreach work and support with victims of racist and far-right violence, and we are basically, as journalists, writing about Nazis all day, stalking them online, finding out what they're up to, analysing and assessing the damage the AfD is doing to the political landscape in Germany, and also looking at conspiracy ideologies, everything from the new coronavirus inspired wild theories online to weird phenomenons like QAnon, which is very big in the USA right now. So yeah, we do interviews as well, and we just sort of try and provide, so our main topics are far-right extremism, racism, anti-Semitism, and any other kind of evil discrimination lurking about in the world. The foundation is named after Amadeu Antonio, who was originally from Angola, and he was one of the first known victims of far-right violence in post-Wende Germany, and he was murdered by a group of Nazis.
And the foundation keeps track, doesn't it, of all the people who are killed? And
I wasn't aware of that, but that sounds like something we would do.
Yeah.
I mean, Amadeu Antonio is sadly just the first of many people that have been murdered by far-right extremists. After the fall of the wall, especially mostly in East Germany, you saw a massive spike in right-wing violence that was sort of bubbling beneath the surface anyway. The neo-Nazi scene started to organize itself in East Germany before the fall of the wall in the 1980s already. Officially, it was denied by the state, but when the wall came down, you really noticed a new wave of nationalism. There are obviously famous events like the Sunflower House in Rostock-Lichtenhagen being set on fire and basically rioted. It was home to Vietnamese contract workers who are in the GDR. That's probably one of the most famous examples of far-right violence in post-Wende Germany.
But first, I wanted to say, we were talking about East Germany. I was in Leipzig this week because there were big anti-gentrification protests and a little bit of violence over last weekend, and I was sent there into the war zone of Konnewitz, which is in southern Leipzig, and which is the home of the sort of alternative far left scene. And I have to say, obviously I am very sympathetic to the anti-gentrification cause.
I love that you're
what?
Looking at me so nervously while you say this.
Okay. Obviously, but I have to say the people they were not particularly friendly towards journalists coming in from Berlin to report about that scene. And when I was out on the street, I was taking a picture of some of the aftermath. There were like piles of mattresses and shopping trolleys, and one man told me in no uncertain terms that I should leave the place and go to another place, preferably my home. and I found what I noticed was that, especially amongst like left-wing activists, that they felt that people only report about Konnewitz when there is violence and trouble, and they think that a lot of the violence is overblown by the media, which is ironic because the conservative side of the spectrum also says that the media downplays the left-wing violence, which is obviously so I found that even though that I can sort of consider myself fairly leftish, I found like I was sort of stuck in the middle there. And but yeah, I kind of it was a complicated scenario. And what happened was there was been like several months of protests and Leipzig is one of the places in Germany, like a lot of cities, where there's a lot of gentrification going on. There was like a 50% rise in rents in the city in the last 10 years. 25% in the last 5 years, like it's going up all the time, especially in places like Konnewitz, which are quite quite attractive to property developers, and there's a lot of stuff about property speculation and buildings being kept empty just to accumulate value, which is and that has disproportionately affects the marginalized people in society, especially old people and very young people, students and people of immigrant background. And so there's a lot of like that is all happening there. And so there was occasionally the small scene in Leipzig. I don't know, do you ever move in those circles, Nick?
I've been to Konnewitz a few times.
Yeah. Do you think, this is my theory, do you think, because Hamburg and Berlin obviously have very big far left scenes as well, where they're in a kind of very fairly friendly city, whereas Leipzig and Saxony they're like, they must be, and because they're like a smaller community, they must feel a little bit more under siege there.
Yeah, I think also what you're seeing in Leipzig at the moment is just a slightly different dynamic of gentrification. So in cities like Hamburg and Berlin, you have sort of lots of international people moving to the city, driving the prices up as well. In Leipzig, there's a lot more speculation in that sense. I mean, when the prices start to go up in Konnewitz, it's not necessarily because people are moving to Konnewitz in droves. Konnewitz is actually despite their very sort of anti-German stance, is an incredibly German place, ironically. I think there's about 0.05% of people don't come from Germany, and that's fairly typical for Leipzig or large parts of East Germany anyway. So I think it's a cool, hip city. It has lots of arts and culture, and investors are realizing that this is a place they can sort of park their money whilst interest rates are historically low.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what the people there were telling me, that there were a lot of people I noticed as well, because I spoke to some people like from organizations that represented, like, it was one called Leipzig für alle, and I also spoke to the man you got me in touch with, Stefan Kacher, who runs this club called the Distillery, which started out as a squat in the mid-90s, and it started in Konnewitz, and then it moved, and now it's having to move again because of Clubsterben, because it's being turned into luxury apartments and they have to find a new home. And he was like, I thought when I went to interview him, I thought he'd be like, yeah, you know, this violence is kind of inevitable and it's bad, but but he was very much against the violence. He was like really like, this is just brought this kind of brought shame on the city, and all it does is undermine the whole debate, and it's like making things worse for people like me who are trying to like find a resolution, rather than, you know, like he was a bit more like a bit less radical than I thought he would be.
Well, I mean, he runs one of the most successful and long-standing clubs in Leipzig. Distillery is sort of like the Tresor of Leipzig. I mean, he's a businessman as well, and he's a lovely man. It doesn't surprise me at all that he takes this stance. I also think that violence and setting things on fire probably won't, in the short, medium or long term, actually solve the problem of global capitalism and the inevitable effects of gentrification. Yeah. Maybe one thing I wanted to pick up on what you said at the beginning, though, about you sort of rocking up in Konnewitz as a journalist, people maybe not being overly happy to see you. This sort of distrust is fairly sort of understandable by this point. No one's really interested in Konnewitz except when a few bins are set on fire, which inevitably happens every so often. The last time was over just after New Year's Eve. The police had their version of events, which made it sound pretty much like the latest wave of the RAF terrorist organization was regrouping in Konnewitz. There's going to be some kind of communist revolution any moment now, and the police need to go all guns blazing. What really happened was some people from the left-wing spectrum basically made a police car effigy on a small shopping trolley, which might have caught fire, a bit of the paper, and they pushed it onto the crossing, and this sort of justified a very brutal police response. The police then later claimed that one of their officers had to have an emergency operation in surgery. It was all very dramatic. It later came out nothing was actually that dramatic. It wasn't like an emergency life-saving operation. Nothing that bad had really happened. The police were under huge criticism after New Year's Eve for their version of the events, how they spun it on Twitter to gain sympathy from the media. And what the media did in the days after this is, you notice that people who've never really been interested in Konnewitz or Leipzig, journalists from Munich, from Hamburg, from Berlin, rock up on the high-speed train. They're there for a day. They want their quotes. They know what their framing is. If you look at the headlines, for example, in Spiegel or in Die Zeit, they were basically all about the chaos of Konnewitz, and basically you had the idea that the Black Bloc had taken over and anarchy was completely broken out. I've been to Konnewitz quite a few times. I have friends who live there as well. It's a lovely place. It's vibrant, it's very cultural, it's alternative. Most of the cafes or shops are vegan. You can get a beer for fairly cheap. There are a few techno clubs and stuff. I mean, yes, there are left-wing people. Yes, it has like a longer anti-fascist tradition, but it's not some chaotic, lawless quarter. I mean, it has a lot more structure and order than people would maybe like to even admit who live there. Most of the squats have long been legalized. Buildings that were squatted in the 90s are now part of the alternative Konnewitz housing cooperative. So I think it has this like bad boy image in the press, and I think the press like to like to continue sort of in this, because this sells newspapers at the end of the day, but I think everything's over dramatized, and I can understand the frustration of people that live there when yet again something happens, and in this case, no offense, the Deutsche Welle rocks up. They want their photos, they want their scandal, and I think a lot of people that live there are sort of sick of this by this point.
Yeah. And it's also it's also this frustration that we end up debating the morality of rioting, and we see this with what's happening in the States as well, rather than the actual issues that are causing the riots or the unrest or whatever it is. And it's like there are certain groups of people whose unrest and their violent response to the situations they're in are in no way tolerated, and they're never allowed to do that. But then in lots of other ways that kind of is okay. Like just one example, when like a white man who is a father and husband sort of, there was a case recently, I can't remember where, but like kills his wife and children, then the media focus really on like, you know, was he suffering from depression, you know, all of this kind of stuff, where we are willing to look at the motives behind something, but then there's certain groups of people that we just don't afford that privilege to. It's just like, no, how dare you set a police car effigy on fire.
Yeah, I mean, this has a lot to do with framing and definitely the bias of journalists. I mean, I say this as as a privileged white man myself. I think our editorial rooms need to become more diverse to see these different sides of stories.
Yes, I agree with you. And I will never go to Konowitz again. Except...
Just don't like take pictures of people.
Don't take pictures of people.
Get to know it. Go do a bit of skateboarding at Coney Island. Go for a dance at Institute for Zukunft.
I mean, how embarrassing would that be if I was tried to skateboard around a middle-aged man going around Konowitz with a skateboard going, please accept me. Anyway, we did something else this week. The real reason why we got Nick on, even though that was obviously amazing what he just said.
I want to interrupt you. I didn't even get to talk about the Nazis in Konowitz, because that's what I'm actually here for, talking about the far right and everything.
Really?
Yeah.
Are there Nazis in Konowitz?
No, in 2016, 250 Nazis basically rioted in Konowitz, smashed up loads of shops. I was actually there the month afterwards. Still all the shops were boarded up. There was a far-right demo in the city.
Yeah, that's what I kind of meant. I imagine that it must be quite different to be far left in Leipzig than it would be in Berlin, because you'd be more exposed to that, wouldn't you?
Leipzig's a very left-wing city anyway. Okay. I mean, there are still AfD voters who live in Konowitz, but obviously Saxony is has a particular problem with right-wing extremism. Yeah. And what happened in 2016 was that 250 Nazis broke off from a demo, smashed up loads of shops and everything. And a lot of people in Konowitz and Leipzig more generally are still very frustrated because there haven't been any convictions yet. What's more, one of the people who there are now charges against is a warden in a police in a prison. So you see that even parts of the authorities were present amongst the Nazis who were smashing up. Yeah, he was
I'm shocked.
I know.
What?
That was just my little song I wanted to say.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to move on, because the other thing, the next day, I had to go to Magdeburg, where the trial of Stefan B. is going on. Stefan B. is the remember the Halle synagogue man. He attempted to shoot his way into a synagogue, failed, killed 2 people outside, one outside the synagogue itself and one in a kebab shop. And it was it's sort of more or less the halfway stage of the trial so far, and it has been marked by one thing that's been very obvious, is that the co-plaintiffs, who are mainly people who were inside the synagogue at the time and their relatives, are very unhappy with the police investigation that came on about that. So over to you, Nick.
The first thing I'll say is that obviously you need to introduce the defendant in this case. In all my articles so far, I've taken a very conscious decision not to name the attacker. This is out of respect to the victims and the survivors, who wrote an open letter at the beginning of the trial. I think what you see time and time again with these shooters who have mostly radicalized themselves online, they crave infamy, they crave fame, they crave this platform. This attacker's no different. He's also he said on the first day of the trial, he doesn't want the press to pixelate his face. He doesn't want the press to, he basically wants them to write out his full name. And so I want to deny him this craving of infamy and just refer to him as the attacker or the defendant. Yeah, you're completely right. The co-plaintiffs are frustrated with the investigations. A lot of journalists, myself included as well. I think journalists and the co-plaintiffs have actually found out a lot more than the authorities so far. Have you ever been to like the Bürgeramt and you're sort of frustrated at how old school and analog everything is? It's sort of like everything's still on with a typewriter and telegrams, things like that.
Yeah, like faxes and Commodore 64s. It's like where are they finding these computers? Yes. Yeah,
well, this is basically what the German police is also still like. And when you're investigating someone who's radicalized themselves online, received donations in bitcoins, was going on image boards like 8chan and 4chan, was playing games on platforms like Steam, they have absolutely no idea what they're doing. I mean, you notice in the trial as well, most of the people they send to speak about the internet, on one court date, literally 2 of the experts were 24 years old. And I don't want to be ageist here, but they'd literally come straight from university, and their first ever assignment is one of the most important right-wing terrorist cases in post-war Germany. And their answers were very unsatisfactory.
Yeah. As you would expect when you're just new in the job. And I mean, like, there's a bit of a parallel with being a teacher as well, and we're obviously trying to educate students around online conduct and like stuff, but it's so hard, like our knowledge, there's just such a gap between what we're trying to educate them and like kind of like sort of between the police trying to investigate this when they have no understanding of how this situation has built itself up and this radicalization actually happens.
And there's like sort of 2 factors at play at the same time. So on the one hand, like most German authorities, they're completely overwhelmed by anything remotely technical to do with digitalization or the internet. And on the other hand, I think they sort of they sort of smugly think, case closed. He filmed the entire attack. He's already admitted it. What more is there to find out? And the answer is there's a lot more to find out. He's not the first killer of his kind, and he won't be the last, unfortunately. We could learn a lot about his online radicalization, who knew what about the attack in advance. He didn't exist in a vacuum. There's a danger to always speak of a lone wolf. He's anything but a lone wolf. He just is part of a new phenomenon of right-wing terrorism where people are organizing and meeting each other online.
Yeah.
And here they're trading know-how, they're trading blueprints to build guns, they're,
Yeah, so just like fill in on that. So what happened was he streamed it live, he streamed the attack live on a message board, an image board called Megacan. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, as far as I know.
Yeah, and they sort of traced, like it's about 2 or 3 people watched it live and commented under it or something like that, and he was in contact with a few people, and the police has somehow failed to trace any of those people. Is that right?
Yeah, so first of all, one of the biggest fuck ups so far, I would say, was Megacan, this image board. And I have to say at this point, this is a much smaller niche image board. It's much less known than, say, 8chan or the 8chan, because that's now been taken offline, 8kun or things like this. I think he posted the link there on purpose because he thought it would be less likely to taken down. Yeah, it only takes like 2 or 3 people, like you say, actually watched it whilst it was happening live, and this was enough. The video was recorded and then continuously uploaded. Famously, the internet never forgets. So what happened about a week after the attack, journalists traced the image board Megacan, and they found this basically. 2 weeks after the attack, the administrator of this board deletes the entire server, the forum, everything, all the private messages out of fear of repercussions or what will happen. Sometime after this 2 weeks, the authorities finally get round to actually maybe serving a notice to say, actually, we would like to have all of this data. It's already gone by this point. So you see that the authorities were just very incompetent and slow in their dealing with this. And the second thing you mentioned was who was the attacker in contact with. Well, one person that he mentions time and time again is Mark M. Mark M was the administrator, or like board owner as it's called, of a sub-board on 8chan and one other board as well, which I can't remember right now. And the defendant basically claims that Mark M gave him 0.1 bitcoins, which was, in the defendant's version of events, because the Bitcoin exchange rate changes continuously, was about 1,000 euros. There's so many flaws and contradictions in this story that the authorities haven't really bothered to follow up. For example, like a no-brainer would be, why not try and find Mark M and invite him to court and hear about it? The platform Dimok, which is basically used to be part of the Judicial Forum, and they've been covering the trial with really good reports and details. They actually did manage to track down Mark M, who completely condemned the attack, said he's never had any communication with the attacker and had nothing to do with it. So he claims not to know anything about this, like 0.1 bitcoins, which begs the question, why would the attacker say that this Mark M guy, this image board owner, was sort of in on it? Well, the attacker's very anti-Semitic, and there's lots of rumours in the image board scene that Mark M is actually a Jew. It's something he's accused of being all the time. So, I mean, a fairly obvious conclusion would be the attacker's basically trying to dob in Mark for something he didn't know about out of an anti-Semitic motive. But then again, you see here that journalists are actually digging up this information and not the court. The court doesn't really seem very interested in any of this, which is a really big worry.
Yeah. And it's just something that we see with these far-right, online radicalized, usually young white men, time and time and time again, where it's like, you say, the court's like, well, we've got him, we know that he did it, we know he's going to be convicted, case closed. And yeah, like there's this like lone wolf narrative, and it's just bullshit, because there's so many of them, they keep happening in exactly the same way. And unless we start looking at how and why this is happening,
it's a very specific MO as well, and the authorities in this case have been very inept at actually analysing it and evaluating what that means. For example, one expert in court was tasked with comparing the so-called manifestos of the Christchurch shooter and the Halle shooter.
Yeah.
I say manifestos here very loosely because people like to speak of manifestos. Most of these things aren't manifestos, they're insane anti-Semitic racist writings with lots of in-jokes. In the case of the Halle attacker, the main manifesto, inverted commas, is a roughly 12-page PDF that mostly very specifically details his weapons, and on the last page has a sort of a game-inspired list of achievements, which is highly anti-Semitic. For example, the various prizes he would win for killing a female Jew or killing 2 Jews at once, and it's very clearly inspired by the merits and medals you win on games. And this expert from the BKA, which is the federal German police, he basically he said he didn't understand many of the expressions and references used in it. It seemed like he'd spent about 2 days preparing this highly important analysis of the two. One of his main concluding points was the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter is longer and bigger than the one of the Halle shooter, and the Christchurch shooter's one is anti-Semitic and the Halle's one isn't. And then the lawyers of the co-plaintiffs were like, hold on a sec, the so-called manifesto of the Halle shooter isn't have you read it? It's full of anti-Semitic jokes, symbolism, imagery, and then he admitted in court, he's like, actually now that you say it, I do think that this is anti-Semitic.
Oh my God, I cannot imagine what it would be like to be like the family of one of the people who were killed, and because it is horrendous to go through anything like that, but just to feel like there's just such blatant incompetence where you're just, there is no chance that the police are actively and meaningfully working for this kind of stuff to not happen again.
Well, I'm very skeptical, but after the Halle attack, the BKA announced that they're going to create 440 new jobs in the fight against far-right radicalization. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know what there is to be seen of this so far, and I'm also skeptical about how they're recruiting and whom.
Yeah.
But so far, this trial, as with many efforts by the government and the intelligence services and police to combat far-right extremism, doesn't particularly inspire me with confidence.
No, and I think that point about recruitment is interesting. If you are really interested in combating the far right and you are one of the best, possible people for that job, are you going to be applying for a job with the police? Well, I don't know, maybe that's like a...
Well, my biased opinion is obviously the people who are best at combating far-right extremism, most of them already work for the Amadeu Antonio Foundation.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was like, they just go and work for with you. They're not going to be like, I'm going to go and become a cop and fight the far right. That's not a thing that we...
But the court has options here. The court could invite someone from the Antonio and Amadeu Stiftung and as an expert witness, right? Like, there could be a...
Technically, yeah, they could. Yeah,
I mean, there are other. That happens. Expert witnesses are the thing. Like, I just think, because I think the judge is a little bit to blame for this, because she's running it, and she should, like, obviously.
I'm not a big.
Oh, don't get me started on the judge.
Okay. I haven't even read like that much of her stuff, but she said some stuff at the beginning that I didn't like.
She strikes me as fairly naive. This is probably her strategy anyway, but she has like a very motherly tone. So sort of
Jesus wept.
Sort of comforting but authoritative, the way she tries to. I mean, sometimes this gets the defendant to reveal more information about his upbringing and socialization than he otherwise maybe would have. But generally, like for example, one of the examples maybe you're talking about, he seems to have lacked structure, friends, hobbies, whatever. And I think the judge thinks that she sort of tries to pathologize the killer into saying that maybe if he'd had more friends or was part of a sports club.
Didn't she say something ridiculous like, was there not like an open door day at like a synagogue or something?
No, what she said was she said that she suggested that maybe the killer should have gone to visit the synagogue on an open doors day to get a better idea and meet some Jews.
How can you, a man who tried to break into a synagogue, she's suggesting, I know what she's getting at and that's not what she's suggesting, but to be so tone deaf as to say that, oh, if you'd gone to an open door day, like that is comic, darkly comic in its tone deafness.
Not just that, directly before this comment, the killer had admitted that one thing that massively hindered his plan was not having a detailed knowledge of the layout of the synagogue. He said that would have massively helped him. And then she suggested...
so it wasn't like she just accidentally said something. Oh my God.
The other thing is that this has kind of happened before with the NSU trial. There's been a lot of, because the big complaint about the NSU trial was that the court was very much focused on trying to convict her, Beate Schäper, and like the two people who already died, that were her,
the two Uvers,
and
both called Beate Uver. No,
so
Jesus.
And throughout that trial, all the co-plaintiffs' lawyers were saying it wasn't just 3 people; it was clearly more people. And this was like, you're not doing your job. The whole point of this trial, we know that she's guilty. The whole point of this trial is to find out how this happened. But I think there's a kind of a general problem with the judicial system in itself, though, as well, because that is they see their job as just to convict one person or close the case. And for everyone else, for society, for the victims, for everyone, for to try, the whole point of a trial is to get more insight. And I think that's a kind of a fundamental problem with the way that these trials are approached and how the judicial system thinks of itself as well.
There's a common misconception that a trial is some kind of way of, is the be-all and end-all way of processing such a horrible crime like what happened in Halle. I would say it's just the beginning. It's the legal sort of arm of a very long process that also requires a strong civil society. It requires activists, it requires community and support work, it requires radicalization prevention on lots of different levels. But sadly, everyone focuses on the court case, and yeah, you're completely right. After the NSU case, so many questions left unanswered. This case is also highly reminiscent of that in that respect.
Yeah.
I do understand that you cannot expect everything of a court case because it has a very specific legal mandate to follow the letter of the law and all of these things. However, they're not even doing that efficiently. They've got experts in there doing shit jobs, and I think it's also a problem of the people who we have in these systems, who is represented in these systems, our police system and our judicial system or systems, and why it just doesn't really occur to them that this is a bigger picture. There's no conception beyond this is just trying one person for one thing, because they are usually not coming from they're not the kind of people who are systematically victimized by systemic problems and lack of representation.
It's all part of, I guess, of a wider phenomenon of externalizing any perceived threats to the so-called middle of society. So this idea that threats and extremism come from outside, but the inside the core is safe and pure. So if we look at the Halle attacker again, aside from his online radicalization, it's more easy to say that maybe he's only radicalized online or he radicalized himself. But if you actually look at his family structure, his family have made use of their right not to testify in the case. The attacker's mother tried to kill herself after the attack. She wrote sort of a fairly confused suicide note, and it had Stars of David all over it, which were crossed out fairly violently. Also in an interview with Spiegel reporters, just after the attack, she said her son's not anti-Semitic, but he's against those who stand behind all the financial power. Who isn't? And of course, by saying that, she once again completely uses a very standard anti-Semitic trope, the idea of the sort of the puppeteers who are behind all financial power and control. I mean, this is just anti-Semitic without spelling it out. And then you see that he probably heard lots of racist and anti-Semitic things in his everyday life. He lived in rural Saxony. We know what the AfD polls in these areas. This is a much more uncomfortable truth to admit that this didn't come from some extreme fringe of society, but that to the core of society, this so-called holy Mitte of society, that this is also completely susceptible to racist and anti-Semitic ideology. That this comes from within our very society.
It's amazing to me that people still like the sort of German government approach, whilst they have the AfD as a party in the Bundestag, can still pretend like these kind of ideas or anti-Semitism is somehow contrary to this central idea of what it is to be a good German. Like, what? And it is very uncomfortable.
I mean, it's a really uncomfortable truth, because the founding myth or belief of post-war Germany is that there are no more Nazis. Germany and thereby Germans are anti-Semitic. There's no more anti-Semitism here. And anything that challenges this idea, that says, no, actually, there's a lot of continuities between the Shoah, the Holocaust, and now, this is deeply unsettling because it completely undermines the post-war national identity of Germans.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what one of the co-plaintiffs said that as well. She said that she said something about how for German people seem to think that Judaism is a thing of the past. Do you remember? She's called Naomi Henkel-Gümbel, and she kind of said that her impression is, because she was in the synagogue at the time, she was only in Germany because she wanted to join a school, a rabbi school, and she said that her impression of people in the courtroom was that they were thinking of Judaism as something that we used to have in Germany, but we kind of just that ended, and this whole thing that there's still a Jewish community here, and they're part of society, but they kind of shut away, and that's like the synagogue itself was like kind of outside. It was like shut away. It was behind this wall. It was kind of
I mean, Germans have a very specific idea of Jewish life and what a Jew even is, and this is a construct that's mostly based in the past and has nothing to do with reality. For example, last year Spiegel did part of their Spiegel History series. The magazine did on Jewish life in Germany, and the front cover was a traditional photo of what in Germany is called Ostjuden, more Orthodox Jews from the East, a very sort of cliched photo of them with their hats and their curly hair. Which has nothing to do with Jewish life in modern Germany at all, but this is to do with this construct, this imagination of the Jewish life that Germans want to protect in order to absolve their conscience of the horrors of Nazi Germany. I mean, if you actually look at Jewish life in Germany today, you'll see that 80-90% of Jews in Germany actually come from countries of the former Soviet Union and came here from the 1990 onwards, for example. But this is rarely talked about in the German idea or imagination of what Jewish life is here.
I don't know, it's very past-based, and I think, Germany has done so much to try and sort of absolve itself. We have Berlin, which has got these great big memorials or to the kind of horrors that we don't forget, kind of what was perpetrated by the Nazis in the middle of the capital city. And the school history curriculum, it is covered a lot, But I think there is a fundamental flaw in how this is looked at. It is like this kind of past atonement for like a thing that happened in a certain era of German histories when Nazism suddenly became a thing, and then there was this this other who were persecuted, who were different, rather than actually looking like a something that happened in German society where some Germans turned on other Germans, and like it was just I don't think I'm making much sense.
I've got a good example for you. I think it was ZDF, the German state broadcaster, did a survey last year, and according to the survey, about a third of Germans think that their forefathers and mothers, so their ancestors, were resistance fighters during Nazi Germany.
Yeah,
a third.
Yeah,
I mean the actual number is below 1% or something.
Yeah,
but there's this myth, this idea that no one wants to have like the Nazi granddad. No one knew about anything, and I mean in reality, the clear majority of German society fought to the bitter end on the side of the Nazis. And even after their defeat, there was no sort of end to this. I mean, you see that well into the 50s and 60s, there was still loads of Nazi judges trying former SS men and stuff.
Okay. But it happens in waves, though. I don't want. This is kind of a whole other discussion. But it does happen in waves, because the whole '68 generation, that was their main thing, was all our dads are Nazis, and they were like there was a huge generational conflict in the 60s as well between young people. And but I mean, I'm just saying that like this isn't a new debate. It's like there's always been a conflict, and it's true that there were Nazi judges or people in the former NSDAP members who were in high places in society until they died into the 80s, and that's definitely true.
But you also, I mean, you're completely right with 1968. But I mean, 1968 was like a countercultural alternative movement that ended up sort of splitting into two separate movements: the terrorist route that came to an abrupt end eventually with the RAF, and the so-called Long March through the institutions, which is sort of embodied by the modern Green Party. This Long March through the institutions is still a minority position that's still going on. I think that there's a part of German society that from 1968 onwards were very critical of what their parents or grandparents did, but I don't necessarily think this represents the majority for quite a long time in post-war German history.
No, I mean, there's always a reaction against it as well when people kind of feel like it's happening too much. Anyway, we've run out of time.
Happy cheery topics today.
Yeah. Oh.
There are another. This trial is going on. It will probably go on till November, at least, and we'll keep you posted. Or Nick will if you go on Bell Tower News.
Yeah, I wrote something. I mostly write in German, but I wrote a sort of a summary article in English recently about everything you need to know about the Halle trial so far.
Oh, good.
You can
keep that. Yeah, we'll put a link on our Facebook page because loads of people will click on it. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much, Nick, for coming in. Are you a bit drunk and a bit depressed? Because that's how we like to finish.
Yeah, I mean, gin is the perfect drink for, this
it really,
somber conversation.
Yes. But seriously, thank you very, very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the Megacan.
Yay! I love it when someone's really enjoying their Mega. Some of them don't even drink it sometimes.
It's not my first, and it won't be my last.
Yes. And on that note, have a great, and thank you, Konrad, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.